Vov. The Torah tells us, Vayomas Yosef v'chol echov v'chol adorahu. Yosef and all his brothers pass away, and the entire generation who had come to Egypt, they passed away. As we explained, they were the influencers, and they were the luminaries which kept the Jews in place. The moment they passed away, that generation, the Sforno had said, as we learned yesterday, although they were tzaddikim, but they weren't at that special level which they were able to keep the people with a level of understanding that varying from the path is unacceptable. So what happens after they pass away? B'nai Yisrael poru vayishritzu. They become fruitful, yishritzu. They become like rodents. Sheretz in Hebrew is a rodent, meaning they start to proliferate like rodents. And Rashi cites Chazal, the Midrash, that each birth was 6 children per birth, 6 children per litter. A rodent, when it gives birth, it's always never less than 6. So the Jews, when they started to proliferate, it was like rodents. Vayirbu vayatzmu mamod, and they increased in number. Vayatzmu. Now there's a question, what's the meaning? Atzmo. They were powerful to a great degree. So some commentators explain that usually when you have multiple births, especially sextuplets, they're very often, some of them are sickly. Even if one is very healthy, the others are sickly, because the mother is not able to provide sufficient nourishment that they should all be born healthy children. But that was part of the miracle. Just as the natural number was 6, the children of Vayatzmu, they were healthy. They were born with power. Another interpretation is, usually in families, you have leaders and followers, or communities. Each child that was born, among all these unlimited numbers, each child was a personality unto himself. Each child had his own persona of leadership. You know what it means? 6 children, and if a woman gives birth 3 times, you have 18 children walking down the street, and each one believes that the world is his, and he has a level of confidence and leadership. What do you think? How do you think the Egyptian, when he saw this, how do you think he processed this? They understood. The Jews, within no time, they'd taken over the country, as we'll see in a moment. Immediately, they were worried because of all of a sudden this increase of number, and in addition, the persona and the personality and the confidence of every one of these new children. They said it's just a question of time before we're going to be driven out of this country. Vatimole Oretzosam. The land became filled with them. Wherever you turned, you only saw a Jew. We'll see in a moment. Remember, many years ago, when we were on 63rd Street, so I used to park in a garage, maybe a 15-minute walk from the Yad Avram, and the garage attendant was a young man, Hispanic, and he was going to night school to learn to become an architect. So he was educated. So I said to him one day, I said, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? She says, probably about 300 million. I said, what do you think? Why do you think there are 300 million Jews in the world? He says, you open the newspaper, in every field, whether it's medicine, whether it's finance, whether it's economics, whether it's in education, every one of them is a Jew. So my assessment is there are probably about 300 million Jews. So I said to him, I have a secret. There are only 13 million Jews, maximum 15 million Jews. He said, I can't believe it. Impossible. Meaning the Jews, profile-wise, in terms of level of advancing himself and all the fields that he goes into, he's high profile. What happens if you have, not only is that true, but in addition, you have qualitative, you have quantitative. You have literally one family, a woman gives birth 4 times, she has 24 children. And every one of them is high profile. Vatimoli Oretz Osam, the land was filled with them. The Egyptian, wherever he would turn, there was a Jew there. Rashi, Vayishrutzu, Shahoyu Yoldus Shisha Bekir Sechad. The reason why the Torah uses the term like rodents, because they had multiple births. Like a rodent, there was 6 in 1 litter. The Sifarno over here explains what happened when the generation passed away. The Jews started to leave the fold, not leave the fold to intermarry, but in terms whatever they were committed to, they said, and this is the words of the Midrash, we want to be like the Egyptians. We want to be like them. And what did they do? The first thing they did, they stopped circumcising themselves. It's the first thing they did. We want to be like the Egyptians, and they stopped circumcising themselves. So the Midrash cites a pasuk that although initially the Jews were esteemed and revered and loved by the Egyptians, the moment they stopped circumcising themselves, the Egyptians started to despise them. And they created a level of insecurity that the Egyptians wanted to enslave them. Because God says, if you want to be like the Egyptians and stop circumcising yourself, because what's Milah? What is the bris? The bris is the covenant with Hashem. We don't want to identify with God any longer. We don't want to have the bris chashamtu. The bris is the covenant engraved in our flesh. We want to be like the Egyptians. Hashem says, you want to be like the Egyptians? You're going to hear the music, as they say. You're going to become enslaved. The Egyptians are going to become, all of a sudden, rather than revering you and seeing your value, they're going to become wary of you and suspect of you, and the only way they'll be able to deal with it is they're going to have to enslave you. That's the Midrash. So over here, the Sefarno says, Vayishutzu, Acha shemesu kol shivim novesh, notu ledarke shrotzim. That after the 70 individuals of that generation passed away, they went and they behaved like rodents, meaning there was no semblance of recognition afterwards to before. They no longer behaved. They followed the ways of the rodents, meaning physicality to fall to a level which is unacceptable. So that he's interpreting, not the Yishrutzu doesn't mean proliferation-wise, but rather behavior-wise. So I explained, until they said, we want to be like rodents, we want to be like the Egyptians, we were revered, we were esteemed, we were loved, we were valued by the Egyptians. They never had a sense that we were a threat to them. The moment they said we want to be like the Egyptians, and they stopped circumcising themselves, which was a breach of the covenant, because the bris is called bris kodesh. That's the covenant with Hashem. Hashem says, if that's the case, you're going to learn a bitter lesson. And that was the institution of the slavery. We had once asked, the 400 years that was said to Avram Avinu, when do you begin calculating the 400 years? Avram was told that your children for 400 years will be slaves, enslaved, and they'll be afflicted for 400 years, and the nation that will enslave them, afflict them, will be judged, and then they will go out with great wealth. If you start calculating the time from the birth of Yitzchak, it's 400 years. 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak till they left Egypt. But how's that considered slavery? How's that considered affliction? What is it all about? So the Maharal of Prague explains that slavery or enslavement doesn't necessarily mean in the physical sense, or affliction doesn't mean in the physical sense. The Avos HaKadoshim, the holy patriarchs, in terms of what they were, they had no relevance to what the people were all about in terms of paganism, human sacrifice, witchcraft, everything which was the antithesis of Kedusha, of spirituality, they were surrounded with that. Living in that environment, continuously contending with that environment, that's worse than physical slavery. That's worse for them, that was worse than physical affliction. Could you imagine a normal person would be put into an insane asylum and all the people around him, their behavior is so off and so unstable. And in addition, they're all drug addicts. That normal person, what would he, that person was brought up in a refined environment, understanding what it's all about. The person probably would prefer death than live in that environment. It's an environment which is intolerable. How do you live being associated, being surrounded with these kinds of people? So the Avos HaKadoshim, in terms of what they were and the way they internalized the reality of what their purpose was, there was enslavement and that was affliction. What happens all of a sudden? One day you wake up and you say, by the way, this is really paradise. Paganism, all this type of behavior, witchcraft, all this, it's something which is, we see the silver lining in that black cloud. We see the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And then all of a sudden they say, we've seen it wrong all along. And they're attracted to it. So what happens? God says you're supposed to be 400 years in slavery. If you experience the slavery within the context of your spirituality, okay? But now that you see the environment as something attractive and something you want to immerse yourself in, we have to talk about slavery. So the moment they said, we want to be like the Egyptians, and we're going to stop circumcising ourselves, and as we said, name it Orach Chaim HaKodesh, what does the foreskin represent? It represents, that's the expression of the evil, of the tree of knowledge, which causes man to be inclined to everything which is contrary to spirituality. So Hashem says, if that's the case, we have to have slavery. Because that's the only way we're able to meet the decree that you're going to be enslaved for 400 years. So the moment they said, we want to be like the Egyptians, and we're going to stop circumcising themselves, meaning that's going to be our priority in life, what the foreskin represents, if that's the case, now you're going to hear the music. And this is when they immediately became insecure, the Egyptians, and they reigned in on the Jews, and they instituted the slavery. But it's interesting, just want to bring this out. Shevet Levi was the only tribe which was not enslaved. The rest of them were all enslaved. Shevet Levi never was interested, never stopped circumcising themselves. Never. Even in the desert, when the Jews didn't circumcise themselves for 40 years, the Leviim circumcised themselves. Even though there was a risk of what? Of bleeding to death, because as the Gemara tells us, that there was a certain wind did not blow in the desert during that 40-year period, which is essential to the clotting factor in the blood. Because Moshe Rabbeinu says, when he gave the bracha to Levi before he passes away, he says, Ubrischo Yintzoru, that although the Jews did not circumcise themselves in the desert, Brischo Yintzoru, they kept the bris. They always circumcised themselves. In Egypt, they kept the circumcision, and they were always committed to Torah, always. So it's interesting. So in terms of Levi, how did they experience Egypt? They experienced Egypt the way the Avos experienced Canaan. They were in an enslaved situation, intolerable situation. But the rest of the Jews who said, we want to be like the Egyptians, and we're going to stop circumcising themselves, if that's the case, the only way the decree could be fulfilled was only physical bondage, and slavery had to be instituted.